Hi there, Alison here with another Cab Franc du jour. Today we're in the Niagara Peninsula of Ontario, Canada, and we're looking at the 30 Bench 2016 small lot Cabernet Franc. 30 Bench is one of the original boutique wineries in Ontario, with Riesling plantings that date back to the early 1980s. Their oldest Riesling block was planted in 1981. The winery has always been focused on small production wines that are a true expression of place. Today, the winery is part of the Andrew Peller Group, one of Canada's largest wine companies, and their winemaker, Emma Garner, who's one of the great winemaking talents in Ontario, has been with the winery since 2005, and she assumed the role of head winemaker in 2010. The winery and its vineyards are located in the Beamsville Bench VQA sub-appellation. This is one of 4 appellations where the borders and the topography are defined by the Niagara Escarpment. They also include 20 Mile Bench, Short Hills Bench, and also the St. David's Bench, which is located in the Niagara-on-the-Lake area. Now, for those that don't know, this Niagara Escarpment is one of the most important geographical features that makes viticulture in the Niagara Peninsula possible, of course, along with Lake Ontario. The escarpment is essentially a ridge. We're south of Lake Ontario here, and the escarpment rises just shy of 200 meters above sea level. And it helps to not only trap, but also circulate airflow off of Lake Ontario. This airflow helps to reduce disease pressure as well as frost risk, and also helps to warm the temperatures here and moderate the conditions. So it helps to increase the overall vineyard temperature, prolong the growing season, and aid ripening. Now, the escarpment is essentially layers of sedimentary rocks, dolostone, dolomitic limestone, sandstones, and shales that all date to the Paleozoic era. And how hard these rocks are, or how susceptible or resistant they are to erosion, is what has defined the topography of the Niagara Escarpment over the last several millennia. So over the last 2 million years, we've had several glacial events that have happened here. And as the glaciers have receded, they have eroded away these sedimentary rocks to form terraces or benches that make up the vineyard area of the Niagara Escarpment. These wide north-facing terraces make up the larger Lake Iroquois Bench, which sits just above the historic shoreline of the ancient Lake Iroquois, which is present-day Lake Ontario. Now, these benches or terraces can vary in terms of their width as well as their orientation in terms of the degree of the slope and also their elevation as well. Now, where the Beamsville Bench is located, we are on the Bell Terrace. This is the first or the lowest of these terraces. And this terrace stretches the length of the escarpment, but here at the Beamsville Bench, we are at the widest point of the Bell Terrace. Now, the bedrock is several meters below the surface here, and it's layers of what we call whirlpool sandstone and Power Glen shale and sandstone. Now, the microclimate of the Beamsville Bench is worth noting. Here we are the furthest west of these benches, but we are the closest to the lake. We're less than 3 kilometers away from the lake here, so we have a strong moderating influence from Lake Ontario. Now, this does actually make the growing season temperatures a little bit cooler, but it does actually help to extend the growing season on both sides, which actually gives Beamsville Bench an advantage in terms of growing degree days at 1,588, which is actually more growing degree days than what 4 Mile Creek has, which is in Niagara-on-the-Lake, which is one of the top destinations or top areas for Bordeaux varieties in the Niagara Peninsula. Now, where today's wine is coming from, it's a 2.85 acre parcel of vines. That's around 1 hectare or so, and the vines were planted in 2000, and they did choose the Cab Franc clone 327, which is the Bordeaux clone. And this particular vineyard, we're sitting at about 130 meters above sea level, and Emma actually told me that this block of Cabernet Franc is actually on a very gentle south-facing slope, which is rare because the majority of the slopes that make up the Niagara Escarpment are all facing the lake, which is to the north. Now, in terms of topsoil here, the topsoil is defined as Halton till. This is a glacially derived soil, which is essentially, the eroded materials from the escarpment. So these dolostones, dolomites, the sandstones and shales that have eroded away over time and have collected here. And Halton till is defined as predominantly clay. And there's a small amount of silt as well as sand here. And the vineyard as well, I should note, is farmed certified organic. Now, from a winemaking perspective, all the fruit was hand harvested and it was destemmed as well as crushed. And the fermentation takes place in tanks with selected yeast, and it remains on skins for about 2.5 weeks during the fermentation. And they do some punch downs during that time. And then élevage takes place in 225-liter oak barrels, French and American. About 80% of that is French, and 30% or so is new. And it rests in barrel for about 18 months before bottling. And I do want to note as well, vintages. Ontario, we're talking, this is extreme growing conditions for vinifera varieties. So vintage variation is definitely a thing. And 2016 was a banner vintage for red grape varieties, at least in the last decade. It's up there with 2010, 2012, and more recently 2020. So the conditions in 2016, we had a very long, warm growing season with sunny conditions, drier conditions, which is of course very good for ripening red grapes like Cabernet Franc. So let's tuck in. And the nose has a really wonderful perfume to it. There's density and fleshiness to the nose. It's not super lifted or aromatic, but there is a really lovely perfume. And the fruits lean a little bit more on the sweeter side, sweeter red fruits, a little bit of cherry, sour cherry, sort of fleshy, sweet red cherry. There's also a bit of raspberry here. Maybe even a touch of plum and pomegranate as well. But the fruits do lean a little bit more on the red side. And the pyrazines come through on equal footing. I would definitely call this wine a little bit more savory for sure. And the pyrazines are very classic to Niagara Peninsula Cabernet Franc. A bit of cedar leaves as well as cedar wood, and then there's this little touch of like a cured tobacco note as well. But very pretty on the nose, and it is starting to show a little bit of evolution as well. These tertiary characteristics are starting to come through, which is really quite nice. Now, those same fruits come through really nicely on the palate. And the palate is a little bit more spicy, which I quite like. And that could be a little bit of the oak influence coming through, but there is a nice layer of spices here. There's a bit of cinnamon, clove, a bit of star anise as well. And there are some, as I said, tertiary characteristics coming through, like a little bit of like a licorice note, maybe even a touch of a leather element as well. And there is a little bit of an oak influence here, but it's very well integrated. Like there is a touch of like a vanilla bean kind of note, a little bit of a smoke note, but again, very well integrated with the fruit. Now, the acid is really lively, really fresh, and even in a warmer vintage, like we get such great acidities here because we have a nice diurnal shift in terms of temperatures. So the acidities are really fresh, really energetic, and the tannins are firm, and they do have a great velvety texture with a little bit of a chew and sort of that grip on the finish. I would characterize this wine as a bit more full-bodied. It's round, it's got a bit of fleshiness to it, but at the same time, you know, as much as there's power and intensity and structure here, which comes from, I think, that warmer vintage and obviously the winemaking practices used as well, there is restraint here. There is finesse and elegance as well. So it's not all about power. This does have some great definition and structure here, but there's also restraint and elegance as well. And one thing I should note, because we do have vintage variation here, Cabernet Franc actually grows well and ripens well, whether it's a cool vintage or a warm vintage, which is amazing. So we're getting a great diversity of styles from Cabernet Franc in the Niagara Peninsula. In the cooler vintages, we get more Loire-esque styles. In the warmer vintages, we can do a little bit more in terms of extraction and get styles that are a little bit more reminiscent of Bordeaux. And I've always had a difficulty describing Niagara Cabernet Franc to people, but it's not quite Bordeaux, it's not quite Loire, it's not New World, it is Niagara. And I think it's the sort of wine that I could pick something like this out of a lineup without too much difficulty, because it is just so singular in how the wine is expressed in the glass. If you've had this wine before, or any Niagara Cabernet Franc that you absolutely love, let me know what it is in the comments below. And of course, as always, I will be back again soon with another wine. Cheers.